Hey everyone, Steve with Dana Manufacturing. What we're going to be showing you in today's video is how to repair any of the worn out parts in your AP-100 air pump. Now the kit we're going to be using is the Pondmaster Diaphragm Repair Kit for this particular pump. All the parts you need are contained in this bag. There's some plastic parts, a couple metal pieces, some rubber gaskets, diaphragms obviously. And what we're going to do is show you pretty much how we do it here at the Dana factory. We'll show you a few tips and tricks that we use back here in our repair facility for changing out the diaphragm seals, the rubber flappers that are contained in there as well. So let's move forward into the video and let's start the disassembly process and show you how to pull out the old parts and replace them with the new parts. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do before we even open up the case is we're going to take the knob just to double check on the condition of the filter element, the breather element underneath. And it looks to be okay. There doesn't seem to be too much debris or anything in there or dust. So we can just cover that back up, put the knob back on. Now to get to the components that are worn inside the pump mechanism, we're going to turn the pump housing upside down. We'll grab a battery driver, and again, we're only going to use the battery driver to do disassembly. Once we get back into the assembly mode, we're going to put the drill driver away and we're going to do everything by hand because we don't want to strip out any of the screw holes. Okay, with the 4 screws loosened up, we'll remove these 4 screws. We'll take the entire base off the housing, which we can push the housing off to the side at this point. Okay, what we have inside the pump are basically under this plastic cover is the stator, and on each end you have your diaphragm assemblies. These are the assemblies that wear out during the course of use. So what we need to do is let's open up the top cover. 4 screws together with the top cover because most of the screws in this assembly are similar, so you just want to keep them segregated. So what we have here when we look inside is the stator assembly. And in the middle of that stator assembly is a bar that slides back and forth. When the stator is energized, this bar moves back and forth, it slides back and forth, and because it's a 60 hertz pump, it's sliding back and forth 60 cycles a second, or 60 times a second. That's driving your diaphragms back and forth. There's some rubber valves in here that open and close, and that's what pushes air out of the outlet. So, the first thing we're going to need to do is, let's pull off this spring clip. Let's remove this feeder hose. Okay, so what we're looking at now is the diaphragm assembly with the metal washer that holds the diaphragm assembly in place and the slide which moves back and forth linearly. Before we disassemble this diaphragm assembly though, what we want to do is change out our rubber flappers on here. Inside this cap, this housing assembly. So what we need to do is remove these 4 screws, and they may be worn, they may not be worn. It all depends on how worn out all the other parts in the pump are. Now the way these rubber flappers operate are basically like check valves. There's one on the inside of this chamber, there's another one on the opposite side on the outside of the chamber. As the diaphragms are going back and forth and pushing air in and out, these rubber flappers are opening and closing in opposite directions to pull air into the perimeter of the housing and actually push air back down through the chamber below here and push air out of the outlet. So they may be worn, they may not be worn, but they're included in the kit, so we suggest that you change them out. Now to change them out, you're just going to grab one section of it and pull them out. Inside of the kit, we have enough of these to repair both sides of the diaphragm assembly. The assembly is constructed on this side the same way as it is on this side. So we have enough parts to actually do both sides of the assembly. If you should happen to pull both of these rubber stoppers, these rubber check valve covers out at the same time, and you don't remember on which side they went back in, because there are now 4 surfaces that you can put these back in on. If you look at one of the surfaces, you'll see a dome in there, a beveled dome. That's the face on which this cover gets inserted. So one side is flat, one side has a dome to it. You'll take that rubber valve, you'll pull the stem through on the opposite side. There's a small barb on there. You can take a pair of scissors and just cut off about a 1/4 inch on the excess of that little stem, and that one's installed. And we're going to do the same on this one. We'll remove the old one and we'll put a new cap on this side. Pull that stem through, cut off about a 1/4 inch. So this modification is now done. We now have brand new components on this particular face. There's also a rubber gasket that goes on the top, which keeps the air within this chamber and along those 2 check valves. You got to make sure that this rubber gasket is back in its place before you install the cover back on again. Take the 4 screws. All 4 screws have now been refastened back into the check valve assembly. Both rubber check valves have been replaced. And again, we want to make sure that we put our screws back in with a hand tool. We don't want to use a power tool on this because we don't want to accidentally strip out the threads. So the next part we're going to be removing is the diaphragm seal itself. I use a 7mm socket with a nut driver for this. If you want to use an open-end wrench, a box wrench, that's fine as well. But the nut itself is 7mm. So we'll open up this nut. It may be a little difficult coming off because there is a thread locker on there. You're going to find a nut and a lock washer. If there is an excessive amount of thread locker, it's going to be a little difficult to remove, but just turn it off. It'll be fine. They're both metal parts. You can't do any damage. The first part you're going to remove after removing the nut and the lock washer is a metal disc. Behind that metal disc is a wafer washer that has a very slippery surface to it, almost Teflon-like. And the purpose of that is to keep any friction between the diaphragm and the metal disc from happening while you're fastening it and while it's in motion. Once those parts are removed, now we have access to the diaphragm itself. And this entire plastic cover can then be removed. This happens to be the diaphragm itself. The diaphragm on this particular pump was in good condition. On a recent rebuild that we've just done, this happened to be the condition of the diaphragm when we opened up the pump. And what this causes is basically no air to come out of the outlet of the pump because it's not an airtight seal at this point. One of the reasons this does happen is because we're putting too many restrictions on the outlet. This particular pump comes with a manifold with multiple outlets on it, probably about 33 outlets. If you start to close up those outlets and you close up too many of them, you're going to restrict the airflow, you're going to cause the pump to overheat, and by overheating, you're going to deteriorate the rubber diaphragm, and this is the result of it, and eventually your pump just doesn't pump any air anymore. So, behind the diaphragm, we have another Teflon coated washer, and we have a plastic piece. On this plastic piece are 4 pins that are extruded upward, and on the back side we have a channel with 2 ribs on it. That channel needs to fit onto this square surface as you're reassembling it, and that's what lines it up and keeps it in place. And because this part is included in the kit, we're going to end up using it as a replacement part, even though there was nothing wrong with the original part. Now, when we're putting our diaphragm back into this housing, there's a plastic ring that holds the actual diaphragm seal in place. What you'll need to do is take a small straight blade screwdriver and very gently pry out that ring. Now, this ring is not included in the replacement parts kit. It actually never wears out. So by taking that ring out, we've released some of the outward pressure that holds the diaphragm into this flanged housing, and we can start to remove the diaphragm seal. Now, if you look on the diaphragm seal itself and in the receiver that holds it in, the diaphragm is keyed. There's a key at 180 degrees apart, and those keys set themselves inside this plastic receiver, and that keeps the diaphragm from ever spinning around and moving. Now that we have the old diaphragm out, we can put the new one back in. Now, if you look on the seal that either you took out or the new one you're going to put in, you're going to find that one side of it sits deeper than the other side. We're going to take this deeper side, and that's the side that's going to be placed into the housing and pressed into the groove. You may have to stretch it just a little bit to get those keys to line up. It's going to be a tight fit because it is a brand new part. It hasn't been worn in, it's not stretched. Okay, when you're done pressing this in, the keys should be just about flush with the top of your surface, and you may just have to massage this rib down into the groove a little bit. Now you can take your plastic ring and snap that back in along the shoulder, and the outward force of that ring is what's going to hold your diaphragm in place, and that's it. This one's all done. When we're reinstalling the diaphragm seal back onto the stator, there are cases where, as this diaphragm seal wears out, this linear slide will become dislocated and actually start to rub up against one side of the stator. And the way you're going to know that has happened, you're going to see a lot of brown dust or gray dust. And it's actually the dust that has worn off of this slide because it has pinned itself up against one side of the stator. So when we're reassembling it, what we really want to do is get this slide to be centered inside the stator. And the only way to make that happen is to shim up one side while we're reassembling it, so that we know the stator is actually riding in the center, and when we reassemble the diaphragm seals, we know that it's not rubbing up against one side of the stator. So what you want to do is hold on to the card that came with your rebuilding kit, cut it in half, and cut it in half again. What you want to do is make one fold and a second fold, and now use this as a shim when you're reassembling your stator. And there's going to be only one magnetic side, and that side is the side you want to put your shim on. And if you look down the center, you're going to see just about an equal space between both sides of where the stator is and where this slide travels back and forth. You can leave that cardboard shim in there while you're reassembling the pump. Okay, so what we're going to do next, now that we've got everything lined up, we have our shim in place, and we know that we have pretty much equal spacing between the stator laminations and the actual bar that slides back and forth. We're going to reassemble our diaphragm assembly. We're going to place our Teflon coated fiber washer on top of our white disc. We're going to now place this onto the diaphragm seal. And if you notice on the diaphragm seal, there are 2 keys on these points as well as 2 receivers on the plastic disc. We need to line up these 2 keys with the 2 receivers on the plastic disc. And with that, we'll see the 4 pins pierce through the diaphragm, and we know that everything's locked in place. Now we place our assembly onto the housing, and we'll see our bolt come through the opening in our plastic disc. What we want to do now is take a screwdriver and slightly slide the movement forward so that the ribs on the plastic washer line up with the slide, and we want that to be in the center. Okay, now that we have our diaphragm assembly replaced back into the plastic housing, we're going to put our Teflon coated fiber washer back on. We're going to put the metal disc onto the stem of the screw. Now, while holding the back of the slide slightly forward, we want to put a little bit of thread locker, just a drop or 2 onto the stem of the screw. Then we want to slide our lock washer on. And then we want to put our retaining nut on. And again, we want to use a couple drops of thread locker to keep this from vibrating off. Take our 7mm socket, snug everything back up again. Look from the back side. We can now remove our shim. Everything is centered, and we want to make sure when we look down that we see the rectangular profile of the slide itself inside those 2 ribs that come off your plastic piece in the back there. And it looks like everything's lined up. Everything's lined up in the front. The space between the slide and the 2 edges of the laminations on the stator, they're also pretty much equidistant, so we're in good shape. There's not going to be any rubbing condition going on there. From the front, we're all tightened up. We have our Loctite on. Now we can start to reassemble the flapper assembly that we rebuilt previously. Take this, put it back onto this side. We know that this is the outlet, so it needs to get reattached to the hose on this side again. If you do need to remove this hose, just remove the bottom spring clip. You can take that off, and you can get this hose out of your way. So now we're just going to continue to reassemble the flapper assembly by inserting the screws through the holes, attaching them. Now that we have all our screws tightened up on our flapper assembly, we're going to take our hose, reinstall it onto the neck of the manifold, take our spring clip, put that back on to keep the hose in place. And that pretty much completes the rebuild of the diaphragm assembly. The other side of the pump is identical to the side that we just did. So you would duplicate exactly what we did here on this side of the pump. Now, inside of the housing itself, there's a chamber. In that chamber is where all this air collects once it leaves the diaphragm assembly. And there is a gasket that goes in between this entire unit and the housing itself. So what we're going to do is open up the mounting screws that keep this entire assembly in place within the base, and we're going to change out that rubber gasket. Now that we have all the screws removed from our assembly, we're going to remove the entire pump and stator assembly from the base itself. There's a strain relief here on the back side of the pump that's attached to the power cord. We want to make sure we pull that up. There's also a small cable clamp that holds the cable in place. Now that we have the entire diaphragm assembly removed from the base, we can see that inside there is basically some air filter media, and there are chambers inside this base, and all the air collects in this chamber before it leaves out of the outlet. But we do need to make sure that this is an airtight seal. So there is a gasket that we're going to be replacing, and this gasket does come in your kit. All you need to do is line up the profile of the gasket within the groove of the base, line up the bolt holes with the holes that are in the gasket, and that's pretty much it. You're now going to take your assembly and you're going to lay it back on. Again, all of this is pretty much self-contained, so you can lift it pretty much by the stator housing. And we're going to continue to take the screws, line them back up in the holes, and remount our entire assembly back to the base. So now that we're finishing up our mounting of the assembly back into the base, we need to make sure that the grommet gets slid back into the opening of the base. We need to make sure that the green ground wire gets replaced, and that's going to get put right in the center rear hole of the assembly. And then we also have one more screw that had a cable clamp attached to it. We want to make sure that cable clamp goes back on. Now we can take our plastic cover. We can put that back over our stator assembly. We now have our plastic cover back on top of our stator assembly. All our clips have been reattached to the hoses. All the mounting screws have been put back on. We're now going to take the cover. I'm going to put our cover back onto the housing. We can put our mounting screws at the base with the cover back in. And now that all our screws are tightened and our base is fastened securely to the housing, that completes the entire rebuild of the AP-100. Now what we want to do is plug it in, power it up, and make sure that the repair that we did works well. And we see that there's quite a bit of air coming out of the outlet. So we know we have everything lined up, everything's fastened securely, and the pump is good as new.